Hello, this is Shad Griffin, and today we're going to talk about pricing. And before we can get too in depth in pricing, I think it's important to take a step back and talk about some basic economic concepts. These concepts are things that you learned when you were in microeconomics way back when, more than likely. Things like the demand curve. If you remember from school, a demand curve is simply the relationship between quantity and price. So in this example, you can see that at $3, we would sell 80 units. At $5, we would sell 60 units. And the data underlying the demand curve is something called the demand schedule. So this is the demand schedule that relates to this demand curve, and you can see that the data is represented that we talked about a minute ago. $3 for 80 units and $5 for 60 units is represented here in the schedule. So the schedule is simply just the data underlying the curve itself. Another concept is price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of revenue. Price elasticity of demand is just the percentage change in quantity from percentage change in price. The price elasticity of revenue is the percentage change in revenue from a percentage change in price. You can calculate it here by just taking the percentage change from each data point here in your demand schedule and then come up with a price elasticity of demand. In this case, well, always the price elasticity of demand is negative, and that has to do with the fact that a demand curve is always downward sloping. That is, at higher prices you sell less than you would at lower prices. And here it is graphically. You can see this is the demand curve, this is the price elasticity of demand. And you can see by this curve that it varies from point to point on your demand curve. So with a linear demand curve, the price elasticity of demand is going to be different as you increase price and as you decrease price. Price elasticity of revenue is again same concept. It's different in that it can be positive. It's always going to be positive, or it can be positive or negative. Excuse me. If you have a revenue elasticity of 0, that means that an increase in price is going to lead to no change in revenue. And here's the relationship between demand and revenue plotted in 2 dimensions. The revenue curve is an upward sloping dome-shaped curve with a global maximum. Demand curve is downward sloping. And again, hopefully this rings a bell from when you studied it many years ago. Here's the price elasticity of revenue. Again, it's going to differ as you move at different points along the demand curve. All right, so with that out of the way, let's take a look at a real world, in air quotes, example. And by real world, this is fake data, but the data, even though it is fake, I engineered it. I made it. It's my data. I engineered it to be representative of many situations that I've dealt with in the past. This is what our data looks like. We have 219 stores. Each store has a price, and each store has a quantity sold that they sold at that particular price, and also a revenue associated with the price and quantity. We also have variables, what I will call exogenous or external variables that we can include. Things that would be relevant to the store itself, like how long people around a store would have lived in their current home, what percentage of people around the store are renters, the percentage of people around the store that have children, the average income of people living around the store, how old people around the store are on average, and what percentage of the people around the store speak Spanish. And this type of information is there's several different vendors that can provide this information. I didn't get it from those vendors. I actually made it up. This is a very real world example and very similar to several situations that I've run into in the past. So once you have this data kind of aggregated at a store level, to calculate price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of revenue, it's actually not that hard. What you'll need to do first is take the natural log of each one of these input variables and of your output variable, which is quantity in this case. So using a little bit of Python code, we can translate price to the natural log of price, revenue to the natural log of revenue, quantity to the natural log of quantity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And once we have the natural log of these variables, we can actually calculate an ordinary least squared or OLS regression on those log transformed variables. And the result is actually going to be an elasticity. So in this case, I'm regressing the independent variables on the log of quantity. And this coefficient right here, this negative 0.64, represents the price elasticity of demand. So in this case, the price elasticity of demand is negative 0.64, which, if you recall from our definitions a minute ago, essentially means that if you increase prices by 1%, you would decrease quantity by 0.64%. So it's really that simple. I mean, if you can get your data organized like this, and I've got stores in this case, they could be, they could be, they could be any kind of unit like sales division or maybe region of the country or county or whatever. But if you can get your data organized so that you can calculate a price and a quantity of that particular entity here, in this case a store, all you need to do is do an OLS regression and you can get to elasticity. And the same works for revenue elasticity. Here I'm just regressing revenue on the independent variables on the log of revenue, and I get the price elasticity of revenue, which in this case is negative, which is it's 0.35. So a 1% increase so if you increase prices by $1, you'll increase revenue by 35 cents, basically. Once you have this equation, that this linear equation expressed in your regression, it's very easy to calculate a demand curve, which I did right here. And you'll notice that this demand curve is actually curved. It's a different type of demand curve. The demand curve we looked at earlier was linear, and if you remember, you had a different price elasticity of demand at every price and quantity combination. In this case, we're holding the price elasticity constant. So when you do that, you end up with a curved relationship between quantity and price. But it's really easy to get there once you build this regression right here. Okay, so we've been able to calculate the price elasticity of demand, the price elasticity of revenue for all stores. What I'm going to do in the third section is actually I'm going to take the stores and I'm going to create segments. Then I'm going to calculate the elasticity for the individual segments of stores. So why would you want to do this? In economics, there's something called price discrimination. And I actually give, I think, an example in this notebook that I think will resonate with you. Let's say you've got two people walking into a store to buy a bottle of water. And the guy that owns the store has priced the bottle of water at, let's say, $1.10. One guy walks in the store and he's been sitting in his air conditioned car for the last hour. He wants a bottle of water. But if you compare his demand for the water to another guy who's actually been out in the hot sun and is really thirsty, it's going to be a lot less. So you have two people that are same in every way, except one is really, really thirsty and one is not very thirsty. The one that's really thirsty is going to have higher demand for water. I mean, that makes sense, right? The thirstier you are, the more you want to drink. Price discrimination is essentially the ability to charge those two different people different prices. So charge the thirsty person more for the bottle of water than the person who's not thirsty. Word of caution, sometimes this can be illegal, but people do it in the economy all the time. Airlines are very famous for doing this. And in this case, we're looking at different stores, and I think what we're doing here, not a lawyer, but I think it would be perfectly legal. We're looking at different stores, and we're going to look at the demand for these different stores and charge according to that demand. So if we have one group of stores that, for example, loves your product and can't get enough of it, then you want to charge more in that store than if you've got another store where they're just kind of really passive about your product. So if you can take your customer base and you can separate it into groups based on demand and charge different prices for those groups. That's called price discrimination. And mathematically, it can be proven that the more you can price discriminate relative to demand, the higher your profits are going to be. And there's books written on the topic. If you want to research it yourself, please do. So let's see if we can price discriminate here. The first step in doing that is going to be to create segments. So the way that I created segments in this case, and this has worked really well for me in the past in a few situations, is I go back to my linear demand curve, or excuse me, my demand curve, or my not my linear demand curve, my constant elasticity demand curve. And I take my OLS regression results and I run this model. And I'm going to take the residual from this model. So the difference between the predicted quantity at a certain price and the actual quantity at a certain price. So if we take a step back and kind of look at what the residual means in this case, where we have, so again, this is the difference between the actual price or the actual quantity and the expected quantity. If we just think about what that means, if a store has let's say the price is $10, and the model says that they should sell 100 units, but in reality they're selling 200 units. What does that say about the store? Well, it's selling more than we would expect. So one way to think of it is that store is overperforming. It's doing better than the model would predict. Likewise, if we have a store that's selling, at a price of $10 is selling, we would expect them to sell at a price of $10, let's say 100 units, and they're actually selling 50 units. They're selling less than we would expect. So in that case, they're underperforming. So what I've done is I've taken the residual for each store. So the difference between what we would expect them to sell and what they're actually selling. And I set that aside. And then I also take the price of each store and I compare it to the average price for all stores. So based on those two different metrics that I created, one would be what I call the price delta, which is the difference between a particular store and the average stores, the price of a particular store and the average price for all stores, and also the residual between the quantity that we would expect them to sell and the quantity that they did sell. I take those two variables and I cluster the stores, just using a k-means cluster. And I ended up with 5 different clusters. I actually experimented, with several different cluster sizes, and 5 seemed to work the best. And then once I do that, I calculate the average, the price delta in the R quantity, or the residual for each store, based on my 5 clusters. And you can see it actually separates out pretty well. Cluster 3 represents stores that are priced very low and underperforming. Cluster 4 represents stores that are priced a little low and are overperforming. And then cluster 0 and cluster 1 kind of differ. So I think by using the residual and the average price, we've been able, it doesn't tell us how to price these individual segments, but I think we've got groups of stores that are fundamentally different. Once we have these clusters, we can go back to our original, well, here's what it looks like graphically, if you kind of want to look at it. I think that turned out pretty nicely. So once we have these clusters created, we can calculate the revenue and price elasticity of demand for each one of those groups of stores. And that's what I do here in this section. So overall, I go through another little section here. I go into detail about how these results don't really fit with the regression results we did in the earlier section, and that's going to happen, and that's something you have to manage, and that's something that you always have to keep in mind when you're doing this type of work, is that a lot of times the data isn't going to line up perfectly as you slice and dice it when you're calculating statistics anyway. But anyway, I had 5 different segments. Segment 0 has an elasticity of 0.5883. So an increase in price for this particular group of stores is going to bring a 1% increase in price is going to bring a 0.58% increase in revenue. For segment 1, it's about 20.2 less than 5.8, so about 0.38. For segment 2, it's about 0.13 less, so what's that? That's point, 0.4, 0.45, something like that. And I actually went through the math and calculated it down here. So this is the revenue elasticity for each individual store. And if you don't understand how I got there, just Google interactive dummy variables and ordinarily OLS regression, and you can see how I'm actually getting those numbers based on this the math behind this regression equation. But here I put it all together. So we have, for cluster 1, we have the price delta, the R quantity, and the revenue elasticity. Cluster 2, we have the price delta, the residual in revenue, and the revenue elasticity all the way down. And then based on this information, it's not a crystal ball for sure, but you can actually make some real fundamental pricing decisions. And like what I went through here, I said what I would do, making some assumptions about what's been done in the past, how I would approach this market. And then finally, down here at the bottom, I actually calculate the constant elasticity revenue, constant elasticity demand curve for each segment. And you can see segment 4 has the highest demand, and segment 1 has the lowest curve. So anyway, just to kind of go through, kind of summarize what we're trying to do here is, in this notebook, I kind of walk through, and I would encourage you to read it, but I essentially go through, show you how to calculate, elasticities for both quantity and revenue, price elasticity of demand, price elasticity of revenue. I show how to price discriminate when you have stores, in this case, how you can create clusters and calculate separate elasticities for those clusters. And I show how you can finally, create a demand curve for each one of your clusters as well. But anyway, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Hope this is helpful. Thanks a lot.